Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm joined by Nadia Schadlow, the former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy in the Trump administration, and currently a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, as well as co-chair of the Hamilton Commission on Securing America's National Security Innovation Base. Nadia is a longtime strategic thinker. We're going to step back and look at some of the bigger strategic concepts we've discussed on different episodes of this podcast. What does preeminence mean? How do we think of overmatch and balance of power? So strap in, we're going to do some strategery. But first, as always, Nadia, why don't we start with you? How did you get into this line of work, thinking about strategy and national security across the board, not just the Indo-Pacific?
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me as a guest. Of course, I'd rather be in Sydney, in lovely Sydney, but I'm here in the cold and in the Northeast. But it's great to see you again. So basically, like many students of this field, I went to college with a vague interest in international politics. And specifically, I did go into college with an interest in understanding the Soviet Union. I had an interest in the Russian language, which I thought and continue to think is a beautiful language. I liked Russian literature. So I went into college really with that mindset. And then over time, kind of shifted away more toward the defense national security space, because at that time during the Cold War, it was you could either do the literature side of things or you could do the international politics side of things. And I became more and more interested in understanding the dynamics of the Cold War. So that's it in a nutshell.
And yeah, for how long were you at the Smith Richardson Foundation? Because that's a fantastic incubator for strategic thinking. I benefited from 4 Smith Richardson grants, but mostly I worked with Al Sung on the Asia side. You had the national security, deterrence, nuclear weapons, the sort of big thing. How long were you there? Because you got to see basically oversee some of the most interesting work coming out in the field from that perch.
Yeah, it was a perfect transition. I had actually been at the Defense Department first, so I did start my career at the Defense Department, learned a lot about how DoD worked or didn't work or might work better, learned a lot about how the policy community functioned, about policy making, kind of the nuts and bolts. Then moving to Smith Richardson, which, as you said, supports, a range of research and analysis on a range of topics. That really gave me a broad strategic overview of the challenges and opportunities facing the United States. So, as you said, we did a big portfolio of work on understanding dynamics in Asia, on countries in Asia, looking at what should NATO look like as it evolved, what should U.S. force structure look like as it evolved. So we funded a range of individuals across the both bipartisan, a wide spectrum of people doing, I think, really interesting work. And I think much of it has held up. As you said, we supported your work for many years, and most of the China scholars, Russia scholars, defense policy experts, I would say, throughout Washington.
Sort of younger academics listening, Smith Richardson Foundation also has book grants for people to turn their dissertations or their manuscripts into books. And it is a foundation, one of the few really, that focuses on policy relevant scholarship in the US. So super important.
Yeah, just to that point, I'm not there anymore, but, we believe that books still matter. Analysis matters. Research matters. It's not everything can be said in a short X tweet.
Yeah, exactly. And I like writing books. So I've been in Smith Richardson's debt for decades. You ended up as the strategic lead on the National Security Council staff under H.R. McMaster's. You had the pen, or certainly one of the key drafters of the 2017 National Security Strategy. How'd that come about? And did you choose to do the strategy job, or did they come to you asking you to do that?
First, I like to say I was the architect, because strategy involves so many people, so many inputs, so much expertise, and not one person can have all of that. So I think it is important to say that. I've been in the field for a long, long time. I conveyed a willingness to contribute to the first Trump administration, and my skill set in terms of being a strong writer, an integrator, someone who had enough of a broad strategic background to, as I said, with Smith Richardson, we were looking at the policy challenges and opportunities across a whole range of areas. So it was a good fit. I just finished a book, so I kind of knew how to take on a big project like that. There is an organizational element to that, which is important. And I just jumped in and we began from day one thinking about how we as a team would organize a strategy, the content, and the inputs that we would need for it.
The thing that struck me most, and I had an opportunity to talk to HR while you guys were drafting, and the NSC was quite proactive about reaching out to people who'd done work on this field before to test ideas. And it was a really intense process, I could tell. The thing that struck me was, having worked on these in the Bush administration, was the discontinuity, frankly. Every national security strategy since the end of the Cold War, beginning with George Herbert Walker Bush, had somewhere in it a fundamental assumption that great power rivalry could be tamed. For George Herbert Walker Bush, it was the end of the Cold War and new opportunities. For Bill Clinton, it was the strategy of engagement and enlargement and building partnerships. For George W. Bush, it ended up being 9/11, terrorism, the idea we could work with Russia and China, perhaps. Wasn't predicting it, but holding that out as a strategic objective. And then for the Obama administration, it was climate change and transnational issues. What really jumped out at me when the NSS came out and when I first had it described to me by HR was the premise, the predicate that great power rivalry is here to stay. That is the defining characteristic of this era we're in. And of course, the Biden administration kept that. So it was not challenged by the next Democratic administration to come in. Was that a hard sell? Was that basically everyone understood the premise from the beginning and then you had to build the rest of the architecture around it?
Yeah, I don't think it wasn't a hard sell among the new people that had come in with the Trump administration, right? I don't think it was a concept that everyone embraced or was thrilled about. So I think in the sense, many in the State Department, many in the Defense Department, many in other parts of government probably did not agree with it. But the political leadership at the time agreed with it. And it was a view that many, many scholars and others have had for quite a long time. The idea that you can manage the problem of, or you can manage the reality of great power competition, right? It doesn't mean war. It's not aggressive. It's just an acknowledgement of a reality that countries have different interests and their own interests. And that the assumption of all kind of converging toward one political and economic system, an American sort of oriented, one oriented toward democracy and liberalization, was probably not an assumption that we could afford to have. And we couldn't structure our policies around that assumption anymore. There's a whole group of people that believe that in the broader policy community, only that was not the belief, as you pointed out, in the Obama administration.
Yeah, I would put it a little differently. I think there was a debate in the Obama administration. I think there were some real fissures about the fundamental nature of international relations. A lot of people came into that administration associated with the Phoenix Project that was loosely associated with Brookings, I guess not officially. The idea that you could really double down on the earlier national security concepts that we can build partnerships with Russia and China around things like climate change. But there was another group, probably a little closer to Hillary Clinton, who were traditional hard power realists. And I think my sense is the administration, this often happens, by the way, administration debates gets resolved towards the end of the administration, but then the new administration comes in with a clearer idea of what has to be done. I think by the end of the Obama administration, the weight of opinion had shifted in the direction of what you put in the national security strategy, would be my take. There were other things in that strategy, though, that were striking to a lot of people on the outside. It read a little bit more George W. Bush and George Herbert Walker Bush than I expected. I mean, there was an emphasis on the Indo-Pacific, which was important, but it talked about alliances. It even talked about free markets. And that seemed to sort of collide with some of the America First ideas President Trump articulated. And I know from working on the national security strategy in the Bush administration, the political and the strategic imperatives don't always match. It's a bit of an art. How did you go about sort of aligning that strategic concept with the way the president thought? For example, when William Bowden, a brilliant writer, was working on the second Bush national security strategy, somebody commented it sounded like it was Thomas Jefferson. It needed to sound like someone from Texas. So a lot of it's just wordsmithing and tone. But how did you align that strategic concept with a political imperative that a very different kind of president brought to the job?
Yeah, I mean, I guess 2 points. On the first one on Obama, you're absolutely right. I mean, there was, just to make sure I clarify the record, and I always in different talks have given sort of credit to especially the Defense Department and the Obama administration, which did recognize China as a pacing threat and wanted to change things dramatically and saw technology as a way more competitive space. So all of that I agree with. I mean, I guess in going back, I don't see actually a lot of disconnects in the 2017 NSS. I don't recall, I mean, I need to reread it now, but the emphasis was not on free markets. The emphasis was on ensuring that the United States was not disadvantaged by elements of globalization. So if the long-term goal is to have a level playing field, that's how I would put it more. And I do think that's consistent with the way President Trump thought and continues to think. It was about leveling the playing field. It was about ensuring that the United States wasn't disadvantaged by a system that had emerged from the 2000s on. So that's really how I would characterize it more. It was a recognition that arenas of competition, that three main regions were key to these competitions, with the Indo-Pacific being one. This was a term that, as you all know, because you're the expert in this region, that was Prime Minister Abe's term, right? That he was one of the first ones to use Indo-Pacific. And people like Matt Pottinger and others who contributed to the document believed that was really important to articulate as well in the document. The border today, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we'll talk about this going forward. I think the North America, Latin America is going to feature, Latin America especially, is going to feature as a critical region in the strategy going forward. I think we addressed that region as one of the arenas of competition, but that was also structured within the border context.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit more about the 2017 NSS and some of the concepts, and then get your take on the Biden strategy, which also was grounded in the free and open Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Abe's concept, as you said, really informed the new Trump administration's framing of strategy in the region and was largely kept conceptually and embraced by Biden. So, as I've often pointed out, kudos to Abe for disciplining the U.S. system. But there are a couple of things in the 2017 National Security Strategy that still get attention. One of them is this idea of preeminence. And you sometimes hear critics say, well, critics in the US too, by the way, usually on the left, is saying, well, this was just a recipe for endless wars and strangling potential competitors in their cradle and inevitable conflict with China. When I read the preeminence objective, I saw that as more of a traditional preserving a favorable balance of power objective, or Conde Rice, my boss, used to put it as a balance of power that favors freedom. But can you unpack that idea of preeminence? Because it still gets a lot of attention and is used to interpret by U.S. allies and critics in the U.S. what the U.S. is trying to do in the Indo-Pacific.
I would agree with your interpretation more, frankly, of a sense of not what are the conditions that you need to create to be not displaced or not displaced, to maintain more of a sense of stability. So I agree. I mean, I was kind of surprised. I haven't gotten a lot of pushback on that. I guess the idea is that a preeminent military, one that's strong enough to deter adversaries and to be strong enough, if required, to fight and win. So I do think it comes down to maybe people can have different views of that. I can see how, in retrospect, that might be conflated with primacy. I don't think that's the case. It's also not used. I think it's used maybe once or twice in the document. So I don't see it as a theme in the document. And I don't think preeminence as a word is even used. So
I said preeminence, it's primacy, right? That's primacy is the word that.
But I don't think primacy is used. I mean, I'll go.
You're searching the document.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's primacy is not used either. That's why I was surprised because.
Yeah, maybe it's a cottage debate here in Australia and parts of Asia that the U.S. is pursuing primacy. It's fueled by this idea that parts of the Trump administration and some people around President Trump today see this competition ending with the collapse of the CCP, basically. It's sort of when Reagan was asked famously in 1980 or so, how does this end? He says, easy, we win, they lose, about the Soviets. So there's a bit of that tone sometimes, and that's not something most allies want to sign up for, but is that?
That's a narrative that has grown external to the actual document and external to Trump himself. I've literally never heard, both when I was at the White House and since, Trump ever say anything like that. And I could be wrong, find things, but his focus is always on the U.S. side to preserve our freedom of movement, to preserve our advantages, to focus on making sure we're not being taken advantage of. That's the way that he speaks, and those are his emphasis. So I think that narrative is one that has grown up in a different policy community and a different set of academia. And as I said, this is the first time anyone has sort of mentioned primacy as a part of the 2017 strategy. It's ensuring that the United States maintains the ability to capably deter and fight and win if we have to ensure that we are not being displaced. But I see that as different than pursuing primacy, which I'm not sure anyone believes can happen anyway. I mean, there's plenty of discussions bipartisan, the National Defense Commission, right, that was just came out within the past year, bipartisan, said the U.S. is essentially declining. I mean, other powers are increasing relative to us. How can we achieve primacy in the military space? We have competitive advantages. We have areas where we can be stronger, but the relative power of other countries is also increasing.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Nadia, because it may only be in pockets, but you definitely hear a lot of criticism of U.S. foreign policy strategy from the sort of restrainers on the left in the U.S. and from some pretty prominent people in Australia who are basically making the argument that the U.S. is trying to overdo containment and damage to China. And then it's a much more aggressive, a kind of offensive realist strategy that actually exists in any of the documents. And it is because, as you say, a lot of academics and a lot of people try to interpret what it meant. We lived through this in my time in the government over this concept of preemption. After 9/11, we put in the national security strategy that we would have a doctrine of preemption. The U.S. had just been savagely attacked with thousands of Americans killed. And any president would have said, we're not just going to sit around and wait to get hit next time. But people interpreted that as sort of a recipe for endless attacks on anyone in the world who upsets the U.S. And so it's one of the burdens of writing these strategies, Nadia. You can discipline the U.S. government, you can bring in a new strategic concept, but people will be endlessly interpreting it and often in ways that you didn't intend.
Yeah, I mean, that's not to say there's a debate in the Republican Party about whether or not we can coexist with the CCP, but many people think it's up to the CCP. If the CCP continues to relentlessly seek to undermine U.S. interests, increase our vulnerabilities, I think there are people that believe that coexistence will be difficult, but that's not what the 2017 strategy said. And I think it remains to be seen what President Trump himself thinks. So far, I mean, I think he's made it clear. He certainly doesn't want to see conflict in the world, but he wants to ensure that the United States is not disadvantaged and to protect our interests.
Yeah, which is a very consistent theme in American strategic thinking. And it's also very consistent that you have different views of what that means, even within administration. I'm sure you read the Mike Gallagher, Matt Pottinger piece in Foreign Affairs, which has a tone which is a bit more, well, a lot more skeptical about coexistence and anticipates the only real satisfactory outcome is that the U.S. prevails and the CCP.
But that's based on a view and an interpretation of, I think they set forth that they're both experts on the region. They've looked at the CCP, and it's based on the view that it's the CCP's interest to displace the United States and driving us toward conflict. That's a viewpoint.
And also what pieces like that don't tell you is how much risk should the U.S. accept to achieve that goal? And as you pointed out, does the U.S. really have the wherewithal to achieve that goal? As you said, it's largely up to China to determine what the future of the relationship looks like and how confrontational it ends up becoming.
Right. But by the flip point, we do and must have the wherewithal to preserve our interests and to protect our interests, right? And to ensure that we can produce what we need when we need it, and to ensure that we can operate freely in parts of the world that we think are critical to our national interests.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So that's a good transition to some of the specifics in the NSS and the subsequent Trump and Biden administration's actual implementation of policy. How have we done since 2017? Preserving the military edge you described, the industrial base, the access to key parts of the Indo-Pacific. Do you look at the last, 6, 7 years and think in implementing the strategy you worked on, America gets an A, a B minus? Where are the shortfalls? Where are the areas that concern you?
Well, I think it's clear that it was important in setting forth a new direction. It was important in prioritizing and seeing the world in different ways, such as, for instance, seeing technology as not only a means of competition, but a domain of competition that was critical. I mean, our conversations have changed dramatically from 2015, 2016, let's say, as a country. But our ability, the US ability and success in actually implementing a lot of these policy shifts is mixed in different areas. I mean, in some areas we've done well. I mean, certainly we're a lot further ahead in thinking about different operational military concepts when it comes to drones and recognizing the importance of platforms and weapon systems and the need to proliferate non-exquisite weapon systems and having these debates, right? We're not there yet with Replicator, but I give DoD some credit for pushing in that direction. But the implementation problems remain quite serious. I mean, I've pointed out in another article that I wrote earlier this year, I called it the crisis of repetition. We've been talking about the problem of our vulnerability vis-a-vis critical minerals, not for 7 years, not for 10 years, not 20, not 30, but for 40 years, Mike, 40 years. Since 1980, our government, whether it's DoD or state, has pointed out and has expressed concern about a vulnerability in this area. I think the Biden administration chose to prioritize climate and environmental issues over some of these areas that could have pushed us along. So I think in that sense, if Trump had another 4 years right after, he would have continued on reducing regulations, permitting reform, all of the things that are really hampering a lot of the changes in that domain. So I think it's mixed. We've also seen the world become more complicated since Trump left. The past 4 years, we've seen what now everyone has calling this axis of aggressors, or as the Economist has said, a quartet of chaos, or however you want to describe the cooperation between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. That's presenting different operational problems and strategic problems for the United States. So it's testing our flexibility, our agility. I'm actually more confident that President Trump can operate in that domain. The Biden administration has they tend to revert to multilateral processes, right? Multilateral appears many, many, many times in that document. It's a mindset about how the world works. It's a mindset about how you get to where your outcomes are. And I think the Trump mindset is very different. And I think that will end up being better for the outcomes the United States needs.
When you wrote about the security situation recently, you emphasized the U.S. needs to pursue overmatch militarily in key regions. Can you say a bit about what that looks like? I mean, my sense is looking at the military modernization of the PLA, overmatch would be great, but just maintaining deterrence for now is going to require asymmetrical capabilities undersea, uncrewed vehicles, and all the rest. Or is that what you mean by overmatch? Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, that's what I mean. So basically, I was asked by it was Foreign Affairs, by the publication, to say, what has really changed and what would you do differently? And I was thinking about the concept of competition, which was introduced and was a feature of the 2017 strategy, right? It wasn't primacy, it was competition. It was we needed to up our game and compete more effectively in all these arenas, and that we were proud as a country and needed to do so. So it was tied to a lot of issues. But since then, I was thinking competition almost isn't enough anymore. Like I began to think about it almost as a treadmill or a stasis where competing was kind of now had led to this 6-7 years later kind of a stasis of just we're on level 5 on the treadmill, just going along. But we needed now to think a little bit more in a different way. So overmatch is definitely about asymmetries. It's about where our strengths and weaknesses are. It's about upping our game a little bit because we seem to be treading water in many respects. So overmatch is an operational military concept that those familiar with the military will know. It's essentially you don't want to create a fair fight on the battlefield. You want to be able to seize the initiative from your adversary, be creative, be agile. And for those people who are doing policy planning and exercise planning, if you create a scenario in which it's about competition and a scenario in which it's about overmatch, I think you're going to come up with a different set of inputs and a different way of thinking. So that's kind of what interested me. I don't think we can achieve it in all areas and all domains to get back to primacy. But I do think that if you apply an overmatch mindset, you might come up with some different opportunities than a competition one, but I could be wrong.
You use that term, which I find really useful. We need to seize the initiative. So much of the response to gray zone, hybrid warfare, salami slicing, cabbage peeling strategies by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, so much of it is responsive, reactive, controlled. And as a result, the adversary chooses the time and place where they want to seize the initiative. So it's a useful concept. It does require a higher acceptance of risk.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned that the Trump administration established the idea that technology is a domain. There's the famous dime construct is diplomacy and military and other economic areas or domains like space, undersea, and so forth. And yeah, technology competition as a domain is now accepted. Like that is an area we have to watch like hawk to make sure we maintain competitive edge. I'm toying with the idea that friction itself is a domain. There is a strategy within Beijing and elsewhere to increase friction to a level where we can't stand it and they can, to take advantage, to see tolerance for friction, exploitation of friction as a domain they can dominate. And so what you're describing in some ways is accepting the risk that comes with friction by introducing asymmetrical overmatch in certain areas. Do you think strategically, I know in the Indo-Pacific Command and elsewhere, people get this. Do you think politically the US of A is ready, or any democracy is ready to accept a higher level of risk in competition with authoritarian regimes that can suppress domestic concern about risk?
I think so. I think fundamentally, Trump does not think that strength and the expression of strength is not escalatory, right? I think the Biden administration saw the expression of strength as escalatory. I think that's the frame that they fundamentally had. I think Trump sees strength as stabilizing. And so the show of strength, whether it's through words, declaratory policy, whether it's through actions, whether it's through asymmetric actions, I think he sees strength as a positive and as stabilizing. So again, I think it's a fundamentally different sort of frame. In that sense, if you look at our lack of responses across the past year, especially with everything from the cable cutting, with what's happening in the Baltics, Philippines, everywhere, I don't think the world feels like it's in a especially more stable place, right?
Yeah.
But I see Trump as being comfortable with expressions of American strength, but at the same time, not taking unnecessary risks with that. So I'm sure he'll find the right balance.
I think incumbents are losing everywhere because of the combination of inflation and the disorder publics think they see on the world stage.
I mean, adversaries will take advantage of weakness. That's just historical. It's kind of almost human nature, basically. It's the way the world and people tend to operate.
Playing with this game theory a little bit more.
No, that's probably all because I was never good at game theory.
I'm not a game theory guy either, believe me. But just to play amateur game theory a bit more, what we're describing in a overmatch strategy, taking asymmetrical advantage to seize the initiative, reverse the decision-making process so that we're not always reacting. That makes a ton of sense in a blue-red scenario. But one of the asymmetrical advantages the United States has is our alliances, green. And the risk of a higher risk tolerance and overmatch is you start losing allies who aren't quite up for that. And of course, all our allies are very, very different. My guess would be the Japanese would be up for that, and others would not, perhaps. But any thoughts on how you keep allies aligned in a strategy of overmatch? Because you need their capabilities, but you need their bases, you need their presence, you need their diplomatic influence, you need their technology. The technology domain is not one the U.S. dominates. In semiconductors, especially high-end semiconductors, it's mostly Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the Netherlands. So any thoughts on how you keep allies part of this overmatch strategy?
Well, the fundamental challenge in an alliance, but what actually binds allies together, is not affection. It's a shared sense of a threat and fear, right? It's not affection. I think Harold Macmillan said that. I was recently reading about that. So if our allies don't actually fundamentally share the same sense of the threat we have, the threat we face, and aren't willing to partner with us on countering those threats and ensuring our safety, then that's a fundamental problem that is aside from the United States, aside from how allies feel about Trump. That's fundamental. And I would flip the question to saying, why, given what's happening in your region of the world, do you not see the threat in the same way? So I think in that sense, I get sometimes frustrated. Right now, their allies' ability, if you don't share the same fundamental sense of a threat, that is going to be worse for the alliance and the cohesion of the alliance than impolite conversations among our leaders.
That's really interesting. And that, in a nutshell, if you don't mind me saying, would be the difference between a Biden and Trump administration on allies. It's sort of like what you said about multilateralism. The Biden administration sees the building of alliances and partnerships as an objective in itself. I would be sympathetic to that view, but what you're saying is we're in such a competitive environment that the incoming Trump administration is going to be a lot less understanding of allies who aren't carrying their weight. And a lot aren't, particularly in Western Europe.
Right. But I think also the American people. I think, frankly, even had it been a Harris administration, in the end, she would have been faced with similar problems if allies weren't continuing to step up to the plate. And many of them are. So we need to flip the discussion a little bit. I was asked in a discussion with a French journalist, well, isn't the United States the protector of Europe? And I said, no, we're not the protector of Europe. We're a partner to Europe, a partner that shares many similar interests. And we have shared interests and hope for, in many cases, shared outcomes, but we're a partner.
We do surveys at my center in Australia, the US Studies Center in the US and Australia and Japan and elsewhere. And Americans the public expresses very high support for alliances. But the reason why has shifted in recent years. It's because Americans think allies make us safe. And so when you ask Americans, should allies do more? They say, yeah, of course, because they're in the front lines. They've got to do that. So the value prospect of allies for the American public is about their ability to make themselves safe and therefore reinforce deterrence and stability. Somehow the American public sort of gets that fundamental concept, but they are very pro-alliance.
And I am too. I mean, allies are our competitive advantage, clearly, but they're competitive advantage if operationally we can work together and bring resources together on the ground to get things done together. It's not just rhetoric.
This was something I came across with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, who tended to want to put allies in different categories depending on how useful they were. And in the post 9/11 environment, a lot of us, including me, wanted to have a bit of a variation in what allies and partners do and push them to do what would be useful. But it's going to be a debate, I think, in the incoming administration. And a lot of allies are not carrying their weight. Canada's defense spending is 1.3% of GDP, for example. Japan, which is targeting 2% of GDP, which is important and admirable, is dealing with a weak yen, 150 yen of the dollar. So what that 2% of GDP buys in deterrence is not what it was when they targeted 2%. So there's a lot of discussions, I think, that are going to happen over the next year that'll be important and a bit rich and spicy. So something to watch. Another domain, I think, that is critical for competition is what I would call ideational, values, norms. It's not just the fact that we have democracies on one side of various kinds and authoritarian states on the other. It's much more, as I've said on this podcast before, it's much more practical than that. You don't want adversaries to be able to bribe the governments of islands in critical parts of the world to let the PLA set up a base. So operationally, you need strong governance over society. You need strong democratic norms. I see this as a very big difference between Biden and Trump. Some would argue Biden overdid it with his Summit for Democracy and framing of authoritarian states versus democracies as the defining characteristic of our strategic environment. But this was not a theme President Trump himself expressed much interest in. Setting aside for a minute what the Trump administration will actually do, what do you think is the right way to think about ideational competition with adversaries like China? Should it be a core, like a domain that we think about and compete in? Is it something we don't have the luxury to do? How do you think about it in your own framework?
Well, I think certainly ideas and values are important. The U.S. has had a very mixed record in creating alignments just based on that alone. And while I appreciate your point about Biden's approach, not to sound overly harsh, has that approach been successful? Because I'm not really sure it has. So having a summit, calling it a summit of democracies, what does that mean? Again, you're defaulting to kind of a broad multilateral statements and not looking more specifically bilaterally, smaller coalitions of what countries really need, what they're looking for, working with them. The Build Back Better concept, the Build Back Better world concept, which just kind of disappeared at a certain point, was a decarbonization strategy disguised as like a broad democracy strategy. It was all about like forcing decarbonization policies on other countries, which ended up turning them against us because it wasn't possible to get from A to B to Z in realistic timeframes. It wasn't possible to achieve the growth or move on better paths toward growth. So in my view, that level of practicality really matters because I think that ends up then you have a better chance of enforcing the right kinds of leaders in these countries, leaders who might be more willing to work with you if they feel that you do care about their economic growth and are balancing out different interests. So I'm not really sure of the actual successes that the broad rhetoric has. I think Trump will again focus on that, on the bilateral, just look at what's happening in Argentina, right? Changing governments there, having the support of the people, completely changing things. Imagine the success of Argentina as a way that other countries can look to routing out corruption, just as an example of that level of how certain examples might actually have more of a positive ripple effect. And I think something like that Trump would love, like he'd jump into that.
I mean, I kind of agree with you that at times the Biden administration tried to throw too much stuff. When you mix decarbonization with democracy, with freedom, with human rights, it reminds me of that Beach Boys song, "Wouldn't It Be Nice?" Wouldn't it be nice if we had a world where we could do all these things? But in diplomacy, you have to pick and choose. I would put democratic governance pretty high up because you mentioned earlier how important it is for the U.S. to have access and our allies to have access to key technologies in parts of the world. And some of those are under threat because of weak democracy and governance. So I think you can be strategic and prioritize it. Let me ask you one last thing.
Yeah, just one more point, not to be, too political, but the way that we withdrew from Afghanistan, that was a giant human rights disaster. And now, whether or not Trump would have done it or not, we actually don't know. But we do know now that 21 million women are living in a situation where they're barely allowed to speak in public. So you can point to, we have lots of problems, and the United States has always been, it's the city on the hill, how to best advance our values in ways that are sensitive to what other countries want and need, but also recognizing that just saying things isn't enough, right? We have to figure out the best approaches to doing this. And it's a slow process. It's a hard process. But I wouldn't say that there were any particular successes under Biden.
Virtue signaling is a political strategy, but not a foreign policy strategy. I just hope Derek Mitchell and I wrote a piece for CSIS, which people can find on the website, making the case for and the contents of a bipartisan approach to democracy and human rights for the next 4 years. And I hope it stays bipartisan. President Biden would say, don't compare me to God, to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. Compare to the alternative what the U.S. and our friends and partners are trying to do to help people around the world enjoy better governance and women's empowerment is really important to our moral purpose, I think. But even if you don't want to believe in that part, it's important pragmatically for us to maintain access and prevent coercion against vulnerable countries. My guess is people like Marco Rubio are going to think this is very, very important, and there'll be some support for developing a strategy, but we'll have to see. I wanted to ask you about one last big strategic question I get asked a lot. It's the big prize in the Indo-Pacific or globally. Is there a China card for the next period? Is there an opportunity to turn China against Russia? I'm skeptical, but you do hear some people in President Trump's orbit talking about, less so post-Ukraine, but talking about Russia as a way to constrain China. I don't see it, but how do you think about wedge strategies or cost imposition, or maybe even a Trump card, if you will, that you can play among the authoritarian states, or are they really glued together? How do you see it?
I'm not sure. I do think it will be a central issue for the next Trump administration to work through and to develop alternatives. I think there are, two schools of thought on this. Draw them more closely together and let them recognize their own weaknesses and that they're not necessarily good for each other. But I think either way, even if you're able to wedge them apart, that doesn't mean that they're still both going to present problems for the United States. But I do think it is a central difference from the early period when I was working on the national security strategy. The tools and our agency and our ability to actually do that, I think, are somewhat limited. I think our tools are limited in that domain. And it's a lot easier for them to work together to be disruptive than to work together to shape and build something. And, just back to the previous conversation, we are interested in shaping and building positive things, right? I mean, in that sense, yes, I don't want to sound like of course, I believe in American values and our country. The evolution of our country really can't be separated from those values and what they were since the moment we became independent.
Yep, absolutely right. That's the core of a democratic society's support for global engagement in many ways. This has been really interesting. I think it was great we could step back and not talk about the Northern Limit Line or Second Thomas Shoal or line of control or all these hot spots in Asia, and sort of step back and frame all of these issues and strategic competition conceptually. And no one better to do it with than Nadia Schadlow. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I've learned from the podcast and look forward to continuing to learn from you. And thank you.
We'll try to keep it up. Thanks a lot, Nadia. For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.